I start many years ago. I be considered one of the pioneers of the ancient DNA that are still working after this mixing period. Essentially, almost all the Y chromosomes are the step nomads. So essentially, what happens is these foreign men they have children with local women, and local men essentially disappear. Is very dramatic. The other main finding, I think, is the discovery that we
Thank you for being part of this journey to make genetics more accessible to everyone. Your feedback is very much appreciated, and you can also contact us via the link in the description. Thank you.
I would say paleogenomics is the retrieval and analysis of ancient genomes. In the case of human, let's say, paleogenomics, then what we are studying are the genomes of people who lived in the past. And the past is a very broad range, let's say. We have data from extinct hominins close to 400,000 years, and here we have data from people who lived in the last hundreds of years, which probably will a bit interact with what is considered forensics. So in all this range of times, we have now about 13,000 ancient human genomes, mostly but not exclusively from Europe. And with these genomes, we have been able to reconstruct the past migrations. So to understand how these different populations in the last thousands of years have mixed and have come into contact, and how this has created the different layers of ancestry that conforms modern human populations. As I say, especially in Europe, I would say the knowledge is deeper because, among other things, archaeology have been working in this continent for a couple of hundreds of years, and we have literally thousands and thousands of archaeological remains.
What is your personal cursus? What drove you to this area?
Well, I start many years ago. I be considered one of the pioneers of the ancient DNA that are still working, let's say. I originally was interested in history, but also in genetics. So I studied genetics. At the time I start, there were no techniques that could allow us to retrieve complete genomes or whole genomes. We were working with a technique that was called PCR. And this technique was developed just when I started my PhD by Karin Mullis, was awarded a Nobel Prize for this finding. And then what we were doing in those old times was to retrieve small sections of DNA that were, let's say, informative of different aspects. But then after the year 2008, 10, they start developing what is called the second generation sequencing technologies, which are technologies that allow to create a genomic library from an ancient extract from a bone, and then sequence literally billions and billions of sequences from that particular genomic library. And by doing that, we were able to retrieve whole genomes, and then the potentiality of exploring the past really, scale up. So that's a bit the story of the field and a bit my story. Interested in the past and now able to look into the past with great detail. Although, in fact, it's not just looking at the past; it's a bit understanding and planning the future by looking to the past.
Thank you. And I think you have worked on a specific site in Spain at Sidron Cave. Can you present a little bit what is it and what have you been working on that?
Yeah, so Sidron it was an accidental discovery of some mandibles into very deep cave karst in north of Spain, in Asturias, is a region close to the Cantabric Sea. And at the beginning, they didn't know exactly if they were modern humans or Neanderthals, whatever. It was studied in the year 2000 and determined where these mandibles were Neanderthals. And then, as I said, at that time, the techniques didn't allow more than a retrieval of small fragments. They asked me to join the archaeological team. And into the year 2005, I was able to retrieve some fragments of the mitochondrial DNA that proved they were Neanderthals. So these were the first Siberian Neanderthals. And then the excavation, it was very interesting because it's not a traditional Neanderthal site where there are layers of occupational layers in a stratigraphical column. In fact, it was a small cave where 13 remains of 13 Neanderthal people, probably a family, because we have the whole range of sexes and ages, collapse from somewhere in the surface. They have been cannibalized, clearly, and cut into pieces. And then there was a kind of atmospheric, a big storm or something that, collapsed everything into the cave. So they never lived into that cave, which is like has kind of a difficult access. And so along the years, we were able to retrieve, especially from one of the samples, complete exome, the Y chromosome, and many other things, complete mitochondrial DNAs, etc. And also to join the Neanderthal Genome Project that was led by geneticist Svante Pääbo, that was just awarded the Nobel Prize 2022 for precisely for this project.
Okay. And how do you define the difference between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens? How is it two species?
Yeah, well, I would say that geneticists, we are not that interested in defining new species as the paleontologists are. There is a kind of lots and lots of new species in hominins, in paleoanthropology. Maybe I think it's the ratio is like 2 each year or something like that. So we are less interested on how we name things, but to try to understand the evolutionary processes underlying these things. If we just look at the list of genes that are different in modern humans and Neanderthals, this list is very short. It's about 100 genes, which they seem to have fixed differences. And of course, they were quite different. Looking at the skeleton, how different is hard to know. I don't know which is the criteria for saying this is so different that it is a species, because within our own species there are quite a lot of there is quite a lot of skeletal diversity, let's say. But the other main finding, I think, is the discovery that we carry a significant fraction of Neanderthal genes in our genome, especially all the people outside sub-Saharan Africa, like myself. So I carry about 2.5% of Neanderthal genome. And although they are extinct, so no one in modern times carry 100%, let's say, of a Neanderthal genome, that they don't exist anymore. In some sense, they are still with us because these genes we have inherited from them, they probably allow us to adapt to Eurasian conditions, even maybe pathogens that were not in Africa. Our ancestors went out of Africa and met some Neanderthals about 50,000 years ago. They interbred, they had descendants, and this signal is now prevalent across the world to the point that maybe putting together all the billions of modern humans that carry this small but significant fraction of Neanderthal DNA, we could probably gather about 40 or 50% of the complete Neanderthal genome.
And what do we know about the relations and the coexistence between the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthal humans?
I would say there is still a big gap of knowledge. Neanderthals, as I say, they encounter some modern humans, probably in the Middle East, 50,000 years ago, but then 10,000 years later, they were extinct and we were expanding across all the continents. They probably had some kind of symbolic behavior. Now there is people that, there are people that claim even some paintings in some Iberian caves could be made by Neanderthals. I think this is still controversial. In many ways, they were similar to us, to the point I think that, Neanderthal could grow in a human society and became someone very similar to us. On the other hand, although we are finding more and more early modern humans on that time, between 40,000, 50,000, that carry signals of having a Neanderthal ancestor, very close in time, some generations ago, we have been unable to find any Neanderthal on that period that carry any significant, modern human ancestor, let's say, any time soon. So maybe a difference would be that they didn't accept, let's say, mixed descendants, but on the other hand, our ancestors were able to accept anyone. Let's say that this is an intriguing evidence, but I think it explains something to us about their social and probably cultural background.
And nowadays, there are a lot of discussions about new technologies and the project to have this de-extinction and to make revive ancient animals and maybe why not Neanderthals humans. And I know I had seen George Church who said that it might be interesting for health issues for us humans, modern humans, to have this kind of project because Neanderthal could have been immune to certain kind of diseases that would affect us. Do you think that it's a potential outcome that these extinction technologies and genetics can help us modern humans, thanks to other species like animals or Neanderthals?
It's a very long and complex question to start with. I mean, people talk about de-extinction without any established definition of de-extinction. If we think the extinction is a revival of extinct species as they were, then this is not possible and never will be possible. So it is not the extinction. The people who is working now on that, they claim the extinction is another thing, is that if you change some few genes and make a related species still alive slightly similar to the extinct species, then that's already you have the extinct that species. But I would say that most of the people will agree that the extinction, whenever the meaning, it means another thing. And associated to the Neanderthal and these ideas of church, really, I don't think this will never happen for many reasons, some technical, but also obviously ethical reasons. I don't think anyone will be allowed to do an experiment like that, but really, I cannot see the point of doing it. This said, and with all the controversial around the extinction, the science behind is good, is solid. Some of these people have been able to change like 10, 12, 14 genes by editing them, which I think is good science. It's very difficult to change more than 2 or 3 genes at the time. And therefore, this is knowledge that can be used and applied to other problems. And one of the problems, for instance, that comes to my mind, the many endangered species, critically endangered, they have accumulated because of the long history of demographic decline. They have accumulated deleterious mutations that are negative for the survival of the species. So even if the species is still alive, with few individuals, survival long term is very compromised because of these mutations. So one possibility, I know it's not really what we think about the extinction, but the methodologies are the same, would be to remove from the last survivors of these extinct, of these endangered species, to remove these negative mutations and increase the diversity of the last individuals of one endangered species. That would be a perfectly outcome of the extinction science, let's say.
Do you have a specific example, an animal that would be a good example for that?
Oh, many of them. I mean, some endangered species, they have not or some extinct species, they were so critically and so fast in danger that they became extinct without time for losing diversity. But for instance, the Iberian lynx, everyone is happy now because they have increased from 200 to 400 individuals in the last few years. But they went through an incredible demographic bottleneck that made all these individuals share some of these negative mutations that are compromising their survival. It doesn't matter if they increase to 4,000 individuals. They all carry these negative mutations, which are, some of them are, they have cognitive effects. Some of them have implications for fertility and reproduction. Lack of diversity, for instance, is very important also if a new pathogen comes, and it can kill a complete population because the population has no diversity whatsoever. So no one it has diversity in their immune system to answer a new pathogen. So it's difficult to understand because you see many individuals growing, which is a good news anyway, but they are in danger as they were few of them only.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. And another area you studied is the topic of inequality. And what is your relation with the genetics? How do you study inequality?
Yes, as I said, after studying Neanderthals, I moved to modern humans. I was very interested in prehistoric, even historic populations, because there are many archaeological horizons in Europe which are studied from history and from archaeology. The agriculture, the the metals, the Bronze Age, Iron Age, the Roman Empire in Spain, the invasion of the Islamic societies in the 8th century, the formation of the barbarian kingdoms, etc., after the fall of the Roman Empire. And we had individuals from all these periods. And then we start making works analyzing these genomes. And I realized they were, all this data, they were not only speaking about just migrations and changes in ancestry. You could see how a new migration changed the ancestry of the population, blah, blah, but also on social aspects, because biology is really, in humans, related to social structure. And it has an impact on biology by many different means. For instance, powerful men can have many children, while poor men have no children at the same time. Or a powerful man from the past, sometimes they could have 100 wives or more, like Genghis Khan was, is in the chronicles. He had hundreds of concubines. That means hundreds of children that carry your half of your genome. At the same time, it means a powerful man has 100 wives. It means 100 men have no wife at all, of course. And then, because the changes in ancestry could be studied genetically, and also these biases, then we could discover, for instance, the American populations that had been shaped in the last 500 years with the arrival of the Europeans. They were generated in biased ways. For instance, European men having children with native women or with African women. And this, it can be discerned when you analyze the genomes, in this case, even the modern genomes. For instance, a significant fraction of Afro-Americans in the United States, they carry a European fragment of the sections of the genome. About 24% of Afro-Americans' genomes are of European origin. And in some cases, more than 90% of the Y chromosome, which is inherited through from father to sons, are of European origins, while the mitochondrial DNA of the same individuals and the same populations are almost 100% of African origin. Of course, this is a kind of sexual bias, and that explains us a story of sexual dominance in the shaping of these populations. So genetics is not only about understanding the ancestry composition of the modern populations, but also understanding social aspects of past inequality that can be explored, as a side product of all these encounters.
And so you spoke about that example in America. And do you have other examples of similar traits, of differences that we see in different societies with their relation to equality?
Oh yeah, I mean in Europe, for instance, we see in the Bronze Age. I was involved in is about 4,500 years ago. And then there is a new ancestry arriving from the east of Europe. There is what we call a steppe nomads or Yamnaya. These arrived 5,000 years ago from Central Asia. They had a huge impact, genetic impact in Eastern Europe, Central Europe across. They swept all the continent and they arrived 500 years later at the Iberian Peninsula. These people, they were very hierarchical. They buried their important people in these kurgans, these like artificial mounds that required, the work of hundreds of people, sometimes during weeks, to bury a single person. So, of course, this is a sign of inequality in the society. But they also had many other things. They were highly mobile. They had domesticated horses. They had wagons that could, carry goods. That's another thing. One, you have the capacity of accumulating, goods, and then you have the capacity of giving them to your descendants. So there is this relationship between fortune and biology. And then, as I said, this has a huge impact in Eastern Europe at that time, and we discover evidence of violence, etc. But in the Iberian Peninsula, is the place where I studied how this ancestry from Central Asia arrived, and then we had literally hundreds of individuals from that critical period. What we see is the ancestry mixed with the local Iberian ancestry. After 400 years of process of intermixing, it ends up with a kind of average of about 20%, which is found in modern Iberians nowadays, but is a process which is clearly sex biased in the sense that the Y chromosome that enters Europe with these nomads arrives to Iberia is different from the previous ones. The previous ones disappear. And after this mixing period, essentially almost all the Y chromosomes are the steppe nomads. So essentially what happens is these foreign men, they have, children with local women, and local men essentially disappear. It's very dramatic. And of course, it's a kind of a long process. Maybe we shouldn't imagine something like extremely violent and quick, but it's clearly a process that has to be some kind of social structure. Can imagine many different ways of, establishing that essentially you have, children with these people. And after, as I say, 400 years, the turnover, the genetic turnover is done to the point that in Iberian Peninsula, this Y chromosome in some regions is up to 80% of all men living in modern Iberia. They all essentially, most of them, they carry this Y chromosome starting in that period. Of course, it's similar. The time range is similar to what happened in the American continent. It's a process that takes time, but at the end, when you look at the genes, the replacement, the signal is quite similar.
And one thing, when we study this kind of periods like the Bronze Age, what is the reliability of data and of our conclusions? Is that something very likely, or are we not sure?
would say is in this case is very solid because we have many more individuals published. They all explain the same story on many different sites. Of course, there are biases in paleogenomics because you need skeletons, let's say. There are periods which are very bad for us, like the Iron Age, where the people, were incinerating the bodies. Even so, there are some studies on sediments where you can retrieve also DNA. So I would say this, of course, what implies at the end is like a different light on the past. You have archaeology, you have radiocarbon dating, well, let's say from a technical point of view, you have sometimes historians and genetics. And what I am saying is that we need to work together and to build a kind of a multidisciplinary interpretation of the past. It's just another light, of course, is very powerful because we are talking about millions and millions of nucleotides on thousands of genomes. But at the end, the explanation, we see the process, we see the outcome of processes, but the explanation of the social aspects, we really don't know how did they go. On the other hand, the just trying to ignore the results from genetics, like some, good archaeologists try to do, or historians just, writing books about the Bronze Age, ignoring all the results. I would say it's just, is a wrong idea also.
Yeah. And in the same way that you have seen the evolution of technologies for your own work and your own studies, do you anticipate the future technologies that might be very efficient, relevant for you in the coming years or decades?
I feel I'm not sure. It's because the people tend to think that, we will be able to go deeper in time, blah, blah. I don't think so. The DNA is a very fragile molecule. It has been retrieved in the case of mammoth from permafrost, it is this frozen soil in Siberia and Alaska. It has been retrieved in samples that are up to 1.3 million years. So that would be, this horizon is possible in these very, very, very specific conditions where no humans are going to be found anymore anyway. And what happens is essentially the DNA gets fragmented with essentially thermal conditions. The temperature, it doesn't help the DNA, it just destroys it very quickly. And what happens is that we have shorter and shorter fragments. It's not that the DNA disappears, it's just it becomes so short, the sequences, that they are impossible to identify as either human or other things or bacteria. So I cannot foresee any kind of technological improvement that could allow us to go very deep in time, especially in temperate or hot climates, because essentially the DNA is fragmented, and once it's fragmented, there is no way you can really confidently assign it to a specific species. On the other hand, there are some developments on paleoproteomics now, which is a different story. The proteins are much more resistant. They probably can last, in some circumstances, some tens of millions of years. So it would be possible to retrieve these proteins, and of course it's not DNA, but it's something, is a molecular information that could allow you to make phylogenies. So it will never be so powerful as having, the complete set of genes that are involved in so many biological functions, but maybe, a set of proteins with some variants could allow you to make good phylogenies, even in the human lineage. Maybe we'll have proteins from Homo erectus and Homo habilis or Australopithecines, and we will be able to have a molecular tree to compare with the paleontological tree, because there are as many trees as paleontologists right now.
Yeah. And so your last book was about identity and the relation with our DNA. Can you present what was the core ideas of your book?
Yes, it's a bit associated with the idea of inequality. If we think on that, just imagine these steppe nomads, arriving to Europe dominating populations, women, etc. Of course, it has to be some kind of identification. We are us. These are different people, and this happened systematically in many different moments on human history. So this, it can have different levels. Identity can be very complex, can change even along the life of a person. You might think you are someone when you are adolescent, and then you discover that you are different when you are older. And it can go from the individual level, who I am, to the collective level, who the other people thinks I am, or where I do belong from. And then if we think on that, some of these notions, they are anchored in the past. Our family, our extended family, the genealogy. There are many people now working on genealogies. They want to know not their immediate family, which is on, of course, within, record in the same family, but beyond that, some people has been able to build genealogies of millions of people, and then also the population, the clan, the tribe, whenever you want to, or even the species. So some of these notions, I would say most of them, of identity, in fact, they have this time dimension that, of course, can be explored from genetics also. Yeah, there are some aspects of identity maybe associated to culture, language, religion, that maybe are not so linked to genetics, but many others, of course, can be explored from that point of view. And in fact, genetics and again, ancient human genetics are providing new informations on these notions of identity. And identity is going to be important in the 21st century. I think we are seeing a bit of a regionalization of the world after the maximum globalization, maybe associated to the COVID, after the COVID. And therefore, these notions of identity, even if it's just personal, I would say that we are living also in a kind of individualistic era. They can be explored from genetics, and some people really thinks genetics is going to give them the clue of their true identity. And is also related to the fact that there are these private companies of ancestry that gives you the real information of yourself. And this, of course, is a business, but it has a huge social impact. I think it's about 50 million North Americans have already made their genomes through these companies, and therefore these companies, are providing notions of identity that are associated to genetics, and some of them really doubtful, let's say. So there is a huge field to be explored on what genetics can tell us and what cannot tell us.
Thank you. So you made a distinction regarding those private tests, those private companies, saying that there are some that are more trustful and reliable than others. What do you think about this tendency about private tests?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's very complicated indeed. I made myself test in one of these companies many years ago. They are clearly good in some things, like identifying distant cousins, which are beyond family record, let's say. I have a list of, I don't know how many right now, hundreds and hundreds of fourth cousins, five cousins, six cousins, seven cousins. With a seven cousin, something like that, you share a really small fragment of DNA in your genome. And I have, of course, I discovered I have families, these family people across the globe. And in the United States, I don't know how many I have. On the other hand, they are quite good also in trying to point out your ancestry composition. In my case, I had a English grandfather who I never met, although I was named after him. And they, of course, they were able to find that I had some Irish British ancestry and a kind of undefined North European ancestry, blah blah. So but there are two things here to consider. One is that they don't explain how the math they made, the the technical, so so it is not something you can replicate. It's not something that is scientifically like a paper where you have been, reviewed and published. Many people writes me asking, they give me this, can you tell me, can you explain me what does it mean? It's something, it's not my job. And then there are a whole range of companies. Some of them are quite good, I would say. And some of them are giving, in my view, biased and wrong ideas to their customers. For instance, some of them are saying you have 8% of Viking DNA or 25% of Roman DNA, Roman from the Roman Empire. And I think this is totally wrong. It's a misconception, misinterpretation of the data they are using. But I don't know how do they do that, but it's clearly a wrong message. And it bothers me because it's not only wrong, it's just relying yourself, thinking that you are something like that. It can really mess your life. One thing is curiosity, the other thing is thinking that you really are, I don't know what, and change your way of living, or your I don't know, friendships and your social environment because you think you are, I don't know, a Viking or a Neanderthal or something like that.
And to what extent would it be wrong to say you are 20% Viking or Roman? Can you explain what's the problem with this?
Yes, I guess what they do, as I say, is not, is at least for me, isn't clear. I guess they model the genome of their customer, let's say in this case, with Viking genome that had been published and is a genome that was excavated in a Viking context, archaeological context in a specific place, and they model, they use it as a reference, let's say, of the ancestry of your customer, and they model it as 25% or 5%, whatever the number. But this doesn't mean anything. I mean, the ancestry that was in that particular individual in that environment, we can discuss what does it mean to be a Viking, blah, blah, because at the end, this is something, but at least it can be related to a specific archaeological layer in Denmark and that site in the 8th century. That's fine. But it doesn't mean anything. That the Vikings were not, like, they were not a population absolutely different from the rest of Europe. What we see is the different layers of ancestry that sometimes are slightly different, but it doesn't mean almost anything, I would say. It doesn't even mean that you are in a chain of descendants from anyone in the past. This is something that can be explored from other techniques, but not from your general ancestry. So that's one of the things. But yeah, going into that, there are techniques where you can recognize now what is called identity by descent blocks, which are chromosomal fragments which are identical by descendants to people who from the past, let's say modern people and people from the past. Of course, these blocks, break with recombination across generations, so it's only possible to do it from few generations. It means I could find a real genetic ancestor of myself maybe in the 18th century by finding one of these long blocks of DNA identicals, because he was one of my hundreds and hundreds of ancestors at that time. So this is another approach, but they are not doing that. They are just, I think they are using genomes from the past they think are, nice for customers to model the general ancestry of their customers. I mean, nobody would be interested in know that you can be modeled as as a slave that was crucified in the Roman period. So I guess they try to look for interesting ancestries, and it has been, there are some studies that of course, the people is happy to discover they have what they can be considered an interesting ancestry.
Yeah, sure. And more broadly, in your field, what is the one thing that you think most people misunderstand or don't know, don't realize that you think you might explain?
There are there are many things. I would say one of these ancestry composition,
Yeah.
which are different layers, and then you model it statistically. Unless you look for these, specific blocks which if well done, you can deduce you have inherited from someone in the past. The concept of ancestry is a vague concept and is a statistical modeling. I'm not saying it's false, it's just a statistical modeling, and like the people, it has a hard times trying to understand what does it means to have, I don't know, I have like 50% of ancestry that goes into Europe with the first farmers in the Neolithic, because I am from the south of Europe where this ancestry is more prevalent, etc. But this doesn't mean really anything about myself. I am not one of the first farmers that came into Europe actually in any sense. So this is problematic. It's not a concept that you can easily explain. And then also the identification with the specific population is really problematic also because populations are not well defined. They are concepts we use because we need these kinds of concepts, but it doesn't mean genetic proof that these populations exist at all. But now you will, even in these companies, they will list your ancestry, interestingly, by modern countries. So in one of these companies, as I mentioned, I have my ancestry, my Great Britain ancestry, this percentage. I have a category which is French, German put together, which is kind of interesting. And I have 15% of German French ancestry. So this is really misleading and problematic for the people to understand. As I mentioned, I got every week several emails of people explaining me, their ancestries and and asking me questions that I am unable to answer because I am not working in these companies.
And maybe a last question. If we speak about your current work and your current projects, on what are you working now?
I'm working on several things. I'm still working on ancient humans, although we are moving towards Middle Ages essentially. So at the end, I will end up in the present, I think. But especially in Spain, there were many changes. I mentioned the Islamic invasion and the Islamic ancestry, which is really unknown because it was eliminated in the 15th century in a very precise way, I would say. So there is this North African ancestry prevalent in the middle and early Middle Ages, but absent absolutely nowadays in Spain, less than 5%. But then also working on ancient pathogens. One thing the paleogeneticists discovered just 10 years ago, I would say, is that when you retrieve DNA from a person that died in the past, you are retrieving also the pathogens that were living with the person, and in some cases that killed the person. And then these pathogens are now a very interesting field of research, trying to understand the diseases in the past and how they shape our societies. And it's very interesting. We are getting, genomes from Senior pestis, the plague, but many other pathogens, malaria, etc., tuberculosis, lepra, typhoid fever, understanding also many processes of the past that were probably associated to epidemic episodes because all these migrations, sometimes these new people were carrying diseases that were they had some natural immunity after hundreds of years, while the new populations they didn't know these diseases. And then it gives you another layer of complexity to understand the past. Some of the things we associate with the progress of humankind, like increased trade, increased mobility, globalization, urban societies, they are the same, they are perfect for spreading of new diseases and new pandemics that we have suffered one of just 5 years ago. So I am now interested in trying to understand the disease, to try to understand also the history of our societies.